Okay, here is our lectures on Caribbean forestry as part of BIOL6207, and in particular we're looking at sustainable forestry, timber production and non-timber forest products use, and we're focusing in on the Caribbean. So in this lecture we're taking a look at what is forestry. Hopefully you've done my course, Tropical Forest Management and Use, so you know what a forest is and what forestry is, but for those of you who don't or haven't, we will go through that. We'll take a look at how we look at forests and forest use as based on what we've seen from the past and colonial legacies in the Caribbean and around the world. We'll take a look at forestry and briefly touch on indigenous practices and some of the transplanted knowledge from India and Africa in the Caribbean. We'll take a look at the concept of the ecological graft behind forestry, and finally we'll take a look at the current Caribbean context of forestry and forest use. So first of all, forestry, definitions and objectives. Nice picture in the background, isn't there? I think that's a forest in Trinidad, taking a look back, probably arena forest. Alright, so forestry. Forestry is a collective term to describe the science, art and practice of understanding, managing, using, conserving and repairing forests associated with forest and associated ecological systems and processes. So basically forestry is managing and using treed ecosystems, and as you can imagine it's particularly relevant in tropical areas because we tend to have a lot of forests. So that very inclusive definition reflects the variety of values forestry professionals and users ascribe to forests, and in particular users, because there are many different ways in which you can use a forest, and we will go into that in more detail in subsequent slides. There is a range of activities associated with managing forests because there are many different uses. There are numerous uses forests have been put to by people. Like I said, look, I said it and there it is, so it must be true. So traditionally forestry is associated primarily, well, these days forestry has been associated primarily with production forestry activities for timber production. And one of the main reasons for that is because that tends to be the most economic, or the way that you can get the most money out of forests these days. So forestry is multidimensional, and mainly it is multidimensional because you can use it in many different ways. We can use it for timber production, and we have professionals who are involved in timber production, and they will know all about how to manipulate forests for production of timber. We can use it for forestry. There are people who are involved in forestry extension, watershed management, wildlife management, protected areas management. So protected areas are mainly involved in conservation of biodiversity. Watershed managers are mainly involved in production of water from a forest environment. Public recreation management, it's pretty self-evident what that's all about, and sustainable rural development and livelihoods, which is another broad and nebulous, which looks at how forests tend to be used by rural populations, and in particular the different ways like firewood production, maybe even wildlife management, watershed management, and quite a lot of these other uses as well. So forest professionals need to be proficient in many different disciplines, and there are specializations they may go into, like forest and wildlife law enforcement. So get your gun and go arrest some poachers. Forest economics, forest policy and planning, forest engineering and surveying, remote sensing and ecosystem modeling, rural sociology and public education, silviculture and wildlife ecology. So we have many different disciplines there, from ecology, economics, engineering, remote sensing, socioeconomics and sociology, and I'll go back again to ecology. So many different disciplines which are needed to manage forests for all the different uses we want to put them to. So forests, they provide a range of goods and services. Wood, water, food, genetic resources, all of these products, and we also have services like soil protection, carbon sequestration, groundwater recharge, water production, and so on. Forests are also important for aesthetic and cultural and spiritual values. And all these different uses generally come from different stakeholders. So we would have hunters, woodworkers, commercial timber companies, pastoralists and crop farmers, tourism operators, religious groups, government agencies, educational agencies like UE, for instance. All of these stakeholders use forests, and they use forests in different ways for different uses. So forest managers need to understand these different uses and so on. Alright, so all of these different uses may or may not take place in one forest at any one time. Quite often, use of forests tend to be multiple at any one time, particularly when those forests tend to be government owned, because governments represent people, and people are many and diverse, and they will represent many different stakeholders, so that these different stakeholders will have different uses. So any one forest needs to be usable by many different users for different goods and services. Government forests tend to be the main sorts of forests that you find, particularly in tropical countries where the economies tend to be smaller and large areas tend to be owned mainly by the government. So modern forestry is quite often about trying to reconcile all these different uses and all of these different stakeholders. So the challenge of modern forestry remains the balancing of multiple users, multiple products, and multiple goods and services. So the forests in Trinidad may be used for timber production, they may be used for hunting, they may play host to extraction of oil and gas, they may be used for bird watchers. Conservationists who live in the East-West corridor may have a very vested interest in forests in Trinidad as well. So the upshot is that Caribbean forest management, like forest management everywhere, today is extremely complicated. Many different uses, and it will therefore involve a range of different disciplines and different ways of managing the forest. One other point which I need to bring out: the maximum delivery of specific services, goods and services, can often compromise the ability of the system to deliver other goods and services. So for instance, timber production quite often compromises the forest's ability to conserve biodiversity, for instance. It doesn't always have to be like that, but a particular way of managing a forest to produce timber, like for instance clearing it and planting plantations, is going to compromise the other use of the forest, which may be hunting or it may be biodiversity conservation. So maximization, or using a forest for one particular use and maximizing that use, can quite often compromise the ability of the forest to deliver other services. And that's a very important point, particularly in the context of multiple use forestry. So Caribbean forest management is also affected by many external drivers and national systems shaped by complicated histories and land uses. So places like Trinidad and Trinidad's economy simply isn't large enough to be able to just go its own way when global economic pressures and processes change things. So in other words, quite often Trinidad is at the beck and call or at the mercy of what happens in the United States or in China or in Europe. So when things change in those other places, the economic environment of Trinidad changes. And that economic environment in Trinidad will also change how forests are used, how the different expectations of people. So for instance, well, I will go into that, we'll develop that more as we go along. But before we go into the future, we need to look into the past. We need to understand how Caribbean forests have been used in the past. And the first place to look is in the colonial period. That period between the 1500s and the 20th century, the 1900s. So colonial forestry was a fairly big deal back in those periods, particularly from the 1800s and the 1900s. So Caribbean systems today are quite often very much reliant or very much dictated or shaped by how forest management was set up back in the 18 and 1900s. Excuse me. To understand how European colonial powers manage forests, we need to go back and look at how forestry management was developed in those European countries in the past. In 2,000 years ago, 80% of Europe was forested. Today, 34% is forested, but in Europe, historically, deforestation was accompanied by the development of those countries. And what happened in Europe and the development of management of forests in Europe had a lot to do with the reduction in forest resources in those areas. So basically what happened was in Europe, forests were used, they shrunk, they got deforested, they got lost, and as they got more and more scarce, places or things were put in place to try and manage that resource and to try and make it a more sustainable resource. And all those management practices which were developed in Europe were then transferred to places like Trinidad, which were then colonies. So these sorts of things began to be developed in the 1600s and 1700s, and they were transferred to the colonies in the 1800s and 1900s. So by the Middle Ages, about half of Europe's forests were cleared for agriculture. By the 15th and 16th century, European exploitation of forests for fuel, construction and shipbuilding, in particular shipbuilding, was at a maximum, and most of 90% of European forests had been cleared by the mid-18th century. That's the 1700s. Modern forestry was in response to that scarcity of forests, and the Germans were particularly good at their forestry, and many of the other colonial powers used German forest management systems. So in England, which has the most direct impact on the English-speaking Caribbean, forest management dates back to 900 years ago. But that forest management tended to be more on the reservation side of things, so sequestering forests for the use of one particular user, and that particular user may have quite often was the king. So fencing off forest areas and making sure that only one person or one user could use them. Forest management, as it developed over time, allowed and controlled access to other things like fuel wood. Forests were used very much for charcoal burning, producing charcoal for domestic fuel use, and also for straight wood use. Forest management only began to be taught in the 1850s in the UK, and it used quite a lot of the German techniques. Forest cover in the UK was about 5.6% by 1919, when things had been cleared, and one of the big clearing mechanisms was fuel for the Industrial Revolution, and also construction material for the shipbuilding industry, which England's economy relied upon. By the 1990s, forest cover had recovered somewhat and was about 10.6%. But an important point to realize then is English society or English economic systems and the English sensibilities did not see anything wrong in a completely deforested environment. So they would have transferred that attitude into the colonies as well. So having an environment which had no trees in it was something which the English were used to, and they saw no reason not to deforest a landscape, even though trees were the main component of that landscape before they arrived. Alright, so there's a little timeline of some of the human activity in the Caribbean. Important points to note: hunter and gatherer society, there's probably a little impact from the 1400s up to the 1800s. Colonials and decline of forest, particularly in the lowlands, and then with the collapse of agrarian economies in the Caribbean, a lot of with the end of slavery and the increasing labor costs, things like sugarcane and so on pretty much collapse, and forests begin to return to abandon agricultural lands. And from after the Second World War, with the increase in living standards, changing in the use of energy from wood to things like petrochemical energy, you would tend to get abandonment of forests for fuel wood production, and forest areas would increase. So as the economies of the Caribbean nations changed, so did the fate and the use of the forests, and allowed them to grow, to shrink first and then grow back again. Okay? Alright, so blah blah blah. This just shows that colonial forest management spread throughout the British Empire, and under the guidance of the directors of forests, silvicultural techniques and treatment of forests were instituted across the empire. In 1906, a forestry school was established, and staff was trained and sent out to the colonies with a standard set of knowledge and attitudes towards managing forests. By independence, forests were seen as an asset which could be harvested for capital gain to fuel economic growth. And in some colonies, by independence, forests were seen as mechanisms with which to gain foreign exchange, to improve the balance of trade in the colony. However, post-independence, quite often forests were seen as a bank of capital, which could be cleared and cashed in, as it were, to gain capital to provide or fuel development. We need to mention indigenous practices and transplanted knowledge, At the time of colonization of the New World in the 1500s, there was probably about 65 million to 100 million Amerindians around. By the 1600s, that had been catastrophically reduced to about 5 million, mainly due to introduced disease. So the Amerindians they could not cope with diseases like influenza and so on, and they died in the millions. Entire civilizations collapsed. Entire ways of managing ecosystems and landscapes collapsed. And native forests, with the loss of human manipulation, recolonize a large number or a large amount of areas which had been deforested. And we can see this through archaeological evidence throughout much of Latin America and the Caribbean. The people who remain, the Amerindians who remain, lived mainly in those natural ecosystems, and as such they had intimate knowledge of how those systems worked and cultural practices which managed those ecosystems. Through slavery and indentureship, people were brought into the Caribbean and Latin America, and they also brought in knowledge of forest management practices, which they transferred to their new lands. Okay. So forestry, just to re-emphasize that forestry is very complicated. Forestry also acts on a very long time scale, and because of this, quite often a management technique which has been instituted in one particular time, we may not know the results of that management technique for 20 years or so. Therefore, it's very difficult in the short term to understand or to know whether your management techniques are actually working or not. And that makes people see forests as a bit of forestry and forest management as a bit of a hoodoo science, because we don't really know what the effects of a management technique is going to be in for 20 years or so. So there tends to be a certain amount of uncertainty in forest management, particularly in tropical forests, because tropical forests consist of species which are very understudied. People don't know how they're going to react to different types of forest management. So forest management basically took its lessons from temperate forest science from Germany and so on, and has been modified ever since. Tropical forest management in Germany quite often relied on clear felling, because the ecosystems generally regenerated through catastrophic events like fires which decimated the whole forest. Tropical forests are completely different. They tend to regenerate in a steady state manner using death of single or individual trees and creating gaps which would then be recolonized by other individuals. So there tends not to be a large-scale loss. So those clear felling techniques which were used in Germany quite often just did not work in the tropics. You clear a large area of tropical forests, and quite often the first thing that happens is the whole lot gets eroded. Second thing that happens, it gets colonized by weeds, which you have to then spend money to clear away and maintain the growth of the timber trees that you want to keep for a long period, and that will cost a lot of money, so it's just not cost effective. So management techniques generated in temperate forests quite often did not work in the tropics. So there had to be a reassessing and a rejigging of different management techniques in the tropics. All right. Thank you very much. So that's the first lecture, and we'll go on to the second lecture now.